Hey there folks, the number one clipping fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new clipping record, Dead Channel Sky. I have been excited for this one since the day it was announced. I'm not even going to pretend like this hasn't been one of my most hyped albums of the year so far. I mean, nothing sounds like clipping to me, at least. I mean, sure, there's tons of industrial-influenced rap throughout the history of the genre, and that particular niche has gone back decades at this point, but at the same time, I don't think any singular rapper or group have ever really had the exact balance of electronic music, industrial, noise music, narrative/storytelling, darkness, theatricality, and pure charisma that clipping have delivered consistently since their inception, while constantly bringing that to the table with a very obvious and apparent love for the influences that they often bring up directly in the form of their music. And the reality is that, generally speaking, in my experience, they've really never let their fan base down. I mean, it goes without saying that there are certain projects that they've put out over the years that have become more beloved or less beloved than their other works, but they've practically been beloved since day one. I don't think it's ever really been a secret that clipping are a consistent collective of artists. But even with great records going back to the early 2010s, it feels like that they've only recently reached their quote-unquote prime, and I say that with big parentheses around that because I can't imagine they will be exiting that anytime soon. But specifically with 2020's Visions of Bodies Being Burned, their most recent record prior to Dead Channel Sky, being something of a magnum opus, a lesser trio would have followed it up with more of the same. Such an impactful record that was so critically acclaimed and is often seen by the fanbase as one of their biggest and most impressive records creatively and commercially alike. It would have been easy to just make a record that was on the same creative wavelength, and in fact, I think that's what most artists would have done in that situation. However, clipping are anything but predictable, and the result is Dead Channel Sky as a follow-up, a record that is unlike anything that they've ever released before, and also the single best rap album of the year so far for me, so, you know, it turned out pretty good, is my point. Now, science fiction and horror have always been a core element of clipping as a project from one record to the next. I mean, 2016's Splendor in Misery is a record that really dipped itself full body into surrealist, somewhat existentialist sci-fi horror territory, while albums like 2019's There Existed an Addiction to Blood and the aforementioned Visions of Bodies Being Burned turned up an even darker and more gruesome side of clipping that was nonetheless always grounded in reality, making for some of the most grim records of their entire discography. And one could make the argument that Dark Channel Sky is a return to the more directly science fiction themes of some of their earlier works, which will surely please some people who prefer that era of their career over their last couple of records. But with that being said, Dead Channel Sky really takes those visions of a hyper-futuristic and often extraordinarily dark reality with an entirely new approach sonically, which I think is really difficult to not appreciate, even as someone who's been listening to clipping for quite a decent amount of time at this point. I mean, clipping's latest effort still maintains a lot of those purely industrial and noise elements of their previous records. The interludes and transitional moments often highlight that same gritty electronic minimalism that so many people love from them and hearing from them at this point. But this record is more often than not heavily about the newfound techno influences that kind of give a fresh flair to their discography. Not to say that I was getting old of their sound or anything like that, because that certainly is not the case, but it really does feel like a stark reminder here that clipping can be really anything that they want to be, and in turn it results in a record that relentlessly embraces those influences, and the listener is given whiffs of breakbeat, drum and bass, trip-hop, and pure noise at every turn, not really knowing what to expect next, or maybe knowing what to expect relatively, but never really knowing how it's going to be presented or utilized in the context of the record. I mean, clipping have always veered towards the electronic, generally speaking, but never before have they felt, from a production standpoint, this sonically diverse or complex, which is saying a lot because their previous records have always been produced absolutely beautifully, but here we have some of the best songs of their discography just from a creative standpoint alone. Songs like Dodge and Run It are built upon these punchy, dramatic instrumentals, while the squelching synths on the track Keep Pushing, marking a stark stark contrast against the chorus's light orchestral backing ranks among, for me personally, one of the best beats that Clipping have ever laid down on a record to date. William Hudson and Jonathan Snipes' studio work as producers in the role of the behind-the-scenes individuals here are absolutely essential, and not only making Clipping what it is as a project, what they are as a band, but also making Dead Channel Sky one of Clipping's most unique and sonically distinctive releases to date, but also developing the overarching idea of hip-hop and cyberpunk subcultures kind of becoming one, a pretty dominant theme on the album, and something that if you can't necessarily connect with in the same way that you have on past Clipping records, you may not enjoy this album as much. This idea of the subcultures that developed in the rap scene and in the cyberpunk scene being one in the same, or at the very least directly adjacent to each other, is one that constantly permeates Dead Channel Sky, and I for one find it extremely fascinating, and something that not only feels just unique in the context of Clipping's discography, but also something that feels pretty thought-provoking, considering I never really related the two, outside of the few examples where the two genres quite literally did cross over. But this album is based in its entire concept, both sonically and lyrically, on this particular idea, and it only makes sense when one considers the respective subcultures did at one point have pretty similar trajectories, and seemingly had relatively similar futures as well. Just in the case of cyberpunk, that never really happened. Both became culturally relevant in the 1970s before finding a wider cultural and commercial audience throughout the 1980s and 90s, but the difference comes at the turn of the century, where cyberpunk kind of became a plethora of things with the advent of the internet, and became more accurately described as a series of different groups relating to an interest in technology and futurism, without any sort of overarching concept or idea uniting them, whereas rap/hip-hop kind of just continued developing as its own subculture, despite its many subcultures and niche ideas there within it. And in that way, I think this makes for an extremely interesting record, an album that kind of begs the question, what if cyberpunk held on to its stability and its cultural relevance, just like rap did, its mainstream presence, just like rap did, two sister movements that often came in different forms and mediums that nevertheless were from the same era and at times came from different people that were united in their disillusionment with contemporary society and had the desire to create something wholly new that was also raising important questions concerning the future of humanity. And again, while those ideas were often presented in extremely different ways, they nonetheless are united by a similar origin story in one way or another, and Dead Channel Sky, in turn, feels like a record from another dimension entirely, in a lot of ways. A world where two subcultures born out of societal disenchantment found each other for the foreseeable future and faced a bleak utopia as a united movement, rather than the reality of the situation, which was one becoming arguably the most dominant form of popular music for the last couple of decades, and one just sort of fading away into a variety of different subgenres and subcultures of the many different mediums of art that there are out there. It definitely raises an interesting question, presents an interesting alternate reality, and it also makes for one of the most creatively interesting rap albums of the last few years, arguably more so than anything Clipping have ever put out from a conceptual standpoint alone, which is saying a lot considering they've always been pretty great at making creatively and stylistically unique albums that had something interesting to say in one way or another. Ignoring the striking atmosphere that you can find here and the brilliant handling of cyberpunk themes and ideas, Dead Channel Sky is another wonderful outing for Daveed Diggs as he further cements himself as one of the most undeniably distinctive rappers active in the modern day. His delivery often feels a bit different here than what he's brought to Clipping in the past, but I don't think that's a bad thing whatsoever. I mean, his darkly suave character that he brings to the table on Mirror Shades Part 2 feels like more of a persona than we've really ever seen from him before, at least without the context being something extraordinarily gruesome and morbid. It just feels interesting to see him creating a narrative from a different perspective or some sort of character, while also simultaneously being in an entirely new environment sonically based off of the production that's provided to him by the other 2/3 of his group. It just results in that being a pretty interesting moment on the record for him, or the way that he delivers rapid fire lines on the track Change the Channel before the beat cuts out and just drops, and he delivers the exasperated "ah fuck" feels like a prime example of Diggs bringing a new degree of animation to his flows here, which once again, with the very lush and at times very heavy and energetic instrumentals here, suits the album extremely well. And while he has never been a monotonous rapper by any means, it feels nice to hear one of the genre's best active rappers change up his delivery and flow in a way that suits the general tone and vibe of Dead Channel Sky, while also managing to be a new direction for him to go in as a rapper, thus resulting in not only him suiting this record well, but also his appearance and presence on this record feeling fresher than ever before. And the songwriting here is predictably great as well, with a lot of it covering a lot of the cyberpunk and technology era futurism themes that you would expect from a record with a concept like Dead Channel Sky. References to cyberpunk writers like William Gibson and Philip K. Dick on the tracks Code and Mood Organ respectively. See Diggs wearing his sources of cyberpunk influence on his sleeve in a way that really does feel like a love letter to the subculture as well as the classic era of the cyberpunk movement, though in a sense you could really say that about everything surrounding this record. And the fact that Diggs focuses less on direct narratives and more on abstract imagery, not totally unlike 2016's Splendor and Misery, pairs nicely with the more general themes of this record, as it allows for everything to feel less streamlined and just kind of lets the listener get lost in everything, just completely absorbed by this record that feels entirely new for Clipping, is beautifully produced, and takes you on a bit of a post-apocalyptic journey of sorts. And the lack of features here is something that I like a lot as well, as it allows for Diggs' lyricism to be highlighted, as well as the couple of guest verses that you do get here, my personal favorite being from one of my favorite rappers, Aesop Rock, on the track Welcome Home Warrior, kind of just being nice ways to add dynamics to the record towards the end of the album without ever taking away from the frontman of Clipping and his importance in this record. It really does feel like this album knows that it is a great place for all three members of Clipping to shine brilliantly, and while Clipping have never been super feature heavy for the most part throughout their history, it is nice that they specifically chose to go in the direction of just highlighting them and their ideas, and it makes this record feel all the more compelling as a concept, as an idea, as a question being asked to the listener, and at the end of the day, it makes for a record that manages to highlight everything that's great about Clipping beautifully, while also being something completely new for them. Dead Channel Sky is somehow even more than a near-perfect follow-up record to what I would personally consider to be Clipping's masterpiece and one of the best albums of the decade so far, Visions of Bodies Being Burned. This is a record that asks the listener what an alternate reality where two movements born out of a societal post-apocalypse would sound like if they had fused together and stayed strong together as a singular movement, and then promptly answers that question with some of the trio's best work to date. I mean, whether you want to hear Daveed Diggs' charismatic delivery and ever-engaging lyrics, stunning production that perfectly balances a variety of new sounds, a slew of electronic influences, and the things that already made Clipping great in the first place, or you just want to listen to a record that simply poses an idea that feels entirely singular, ground that has never really been covered before, at least not by an album with as much exposure as this record will inevitably get, this is essential. This is an essential record to listen to. If you don't give this one at least somewhat of a shot in 2025, you're missing out on one of the most interesting, one of the most dynamic, one of the most production-wise and lyric-wise striking records of the year, because not only does their latest effort rival their previous record, but it also manages to further cement Clipping as one of the greatest trios in music, period, of the century so far. And, you know, it's still Clipping, bitch. It's gonna stay that way for a long time, I would assume. And if that isn't true, then goddamn, if they wrapped up tomorrow, they'd have a pretty perfect discography. I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.